Okay, in this unit we began covering the diversity of the phylum Animalia. So animals are heterotrophic multicellular organisms, and we can divide them into two distinct developmental classes, either diploblastic, meaning they develop from 2 cell layers, or triploblastic, which are from 3 cell layers. So the Cnidaria, the things like jellyfish and sea anemones, develop from 2 embryonic cell layers, and all the other animals develop from 3 embryonic cell layers. All animals have some sort of body cavity, the simplest being a sac-like organization with a single opening that serves both as mouth and anus, or a coelom, meaning a cavity that contains organs. And the body plans of animals can be either radially or bilaterally symmetric. So the first animals arose about 700 million years ago, and we believe that the animal ancestors may have resembled modern choanoflagellates, which are protists, single-cellular protists that are the closest living relative of animals. So you can see on this figure the choanoflagellates have a cellular structure that looks very much like the cellular structure of a particular kind of cell that is found in sponges called the collar cell. So these are flagellated cells that line the interior of the sponge and beat their flagella to cause water to move through the sponge body so that they can filter food out of the water column. So animals vary according to the sorts of tissues they have, the complexity of the different tissues and organ systems. And so tissues are simply collections of specialized cells which can then organize into different organ systems. And the development, the germ layers give rise to different kinds of tissues. So there are 3 different germ cell layers that are found in embryo. On the outside is the ectoderm. So the ectoderm is on the outside. Oops. So the ectoderm is the outermost layer, and then the endoderm is the innermost layer, and it lines the tube that forms during development, that forms the lumen of the gut, which is in the embryo is referred to as the archenteron. Diploblastic animals only have ectoderm and endoderm, and the triploblastic animals have a cell layer in between the ectoderm and endoderm called mesoderm, meso meaning middle. So most triploblastic animals possess some sort of body cavity, and the body cavity is referred to as a coelom. So that's a cavity that contains organs, and so the true coelomates possess what's called a true coelom. This just means that the coelom is fully lined by mesodermal tissue. In organisms with a pseudocoelom, the tissues that line the coelom and the internal organs are from both mesodermal and endodermal origin. And then some animals that lack a continuous body cavity are called acoelomates. A means without. So if we look at these examples, we're going to work from the bottom up here. So an acoelomate, such as this planarian worm, you can see has a solid body wall without any space between the body wall and the digestive tube. So this is an example of an animal without a coelom. In animals that possess a pseudocoelom, you can see we've got what's referred to as a tube inside a tube sort of organization. So here we have the body wall, which forms the outer tube and is lined with tissue of mesodermal origin. And then we have the inner tube that forms the digestive tract, and that is from endodermal origin. So this qualifies as a pseudocoelomate, and the only organisms that we looked at that possess a pseudocoelom are the nematodes. Okay, then if we look at this earthworm cross-section at the top, you can see we have a tube within a tube sort of organization with the outer body wall and the inner tube formed by the digestive tract. And you can see in this case the entire coelom is lined with the mesodermal tissue diagrammed there in red. So if we look at the general phylogeny of animals, we have them organized here basically according to their complexity and their developmental plans. So you can see here we have the porifera, which are the sponges, and because they don't have true tissues, these organisms are referred to as parazoa. Okay, the remaining animal phyla all have differentiated tissues and are referred to as the eumetazoa. And the first basis for classifying the eumetazoa is based on body symmetry. So you can see here this branch containing the cnidarians. The cnidarians are radially symmetric, while all the remaining organisms are bilaterally symmetric. So among the bilaterally symmetric organisms, they are divided again based on their developmental patterns. So the organisms in the Lophotrochozoa and the Ecdyzoa have protostome development. Meaning their mouth forms first in the developing embryo, and the deuterostomes are organisms where the mouth forms second, and this would include the echinoderms and the chordates, such as the lizard there. So let's look at these individual phyla that we did in the lab. So just an overview of the porifera. So this is predominantly made up of sponges, and all the samples we looked at were sponges. So they are parazoans because they don't have true tissues. And the name of this phylum is based on the porous body of the sponges, and the sponges can have three different body forms. So you can have the simple asconoid body form, which is simply a cup-like structure, and the collar cells would be lining that red inside of the cup. Then we begin to make more complex body forms, such as the ciconoid body form, by creating invaginations in the body wall. And then if we have extensive invaginations that make small chambers in the body wall, we call that leuconoid. Okay, the body wall is made up of skeletal structures called spicules that are embedded in some sort of matrix. So the sponges are divided into three classes. We have the calcarea, which have spicules made up of calcium carbonate, the same material that makes up the skeleton of corals. And there are calcarea sponges that possess all three of the body forms. So some species are asconoid, some species are ciconoid, and some species are leuconoid. The hexanodella are sponges made with spicules. The spicules are made of silica, so a glass-like material, and they are exclusively the ciconoid body form, that intermediate form with the invaginated body wall. The Desmospongiae are sponges with spicules made of calcium and spongin, which is a protein similar to collagen, and these all have the leuconoid body form. So an example of this would be the diver's sponge, like you would see in bath shops. So there are, so going on to the Cnidaria. So the Cnidarians are radially symmetric organisms that are divided into three classes. We have the Hydrozoa, the Scyphozoa, and the Anthozoa. So the Hydrozoa, such as this Obelia, Obelia is a colony of polyps, and there are two different kinds of polyps. So we can have a polyp that is a feeding polyp, such as here, which is a mouth rimmed by a number of tentacles that will capture prey, and is commonly referred to as a feeding polyp. Then we have other polyps, shown here, that are called a gonangium, or a reproductive polyp, and inside that polyp you have developing medusa, or jellyfish-like forms that will bud off of the gonangium and become free-swimming organisms. So if we look at the reproductive cycle of a Obelia here, you can see the zygote will undergo larval developmental stages and will eventually form a ciliated larva called a planula. That planula will settle on a substrate and form a polyp. The mature polyp will begin to grow and form feeding polyps, and as they continue to mature, they will begin to form reproductive polyps or gonangia that will bud off the medusa forms, and those medusa forms will produce gametes Hey, how are you? All right. Just, I'm trying to find a place to hide. I'm making a review on Doceri, and it's not a big deal.
No, well, I was gonna mess with the air, but I won't while you're recording.
Oh, you can. You know where you need to mess with the air.
In that little closet?
In no, in Building 62, the Faculty Training Center. I was going to do it up there, but it's 99 degrees in there. It was blowing heat when the setting is on cool. The thermostat must be
Next door, in the teaching learning center, or in the classroom?
next door, where you have the faculty development.
Yeah, they got a problem with their thermostat. Because the day that we had, when Rich came from.
Right, he was complaining that hot air was blowing on him.
Cold air was blowing, and then it just turned hot. And they got something up there that says you gotta keep it on emergency heat or something, so that thermostat is really messed up. So it's extremely hot in there?
99 degrees.
Yeah,
So
need to know.
I switched it over to heat so that the system would turn off.
Yeah, because otherwise it's just gonna keep trying to make it cold, but it never can.
Yeah.
At least it knows 99 degrees is too much. So yeah, I won't turn this on because it'll make so much noise when you're trying to be cool. See you later.
All right, I'll be done in about 15 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, I just had to hunt for a quiet place to sit because I now share an office with Virginia now, and she has a bunch of students in there for advisement and stuff. So
And when
it's
I
not
close
quiet.
the door sometimes, I get about halfway through and it's like, all right.
So the medusa forms will then produce eggs and sperm by meiosis, which will fuse in fertilization to form a zygote, and the life cycle will continue. So the class Scyphozoa are organisms dominated by the medusa body form. So this would include things such as Aurelia, which is kind of a true jellyfish, and they exist the majority of their lives in a medusa form with a very transient polyp form early in larval development. The Anthozoa are cnidarians where the medusa stage is completely absent. This would include the sea anemones as well as both hard and soft corals. So you can see sea anemones have the polyp form where they have a foot that is on the substrate, holding them down to the substrate, and then their oral disc is facing upward and surrounded by tentacles that will capture prey. So hard corals would be arranged similarly, except they secrete a calcium carbonate skeleton, and they reside inside that the pores of that skeleton. The next phylum we looked at were the Platyhelminthes, or the flatworms for the common name, and they are divided into two lineages, the Catenulida, or chain worms, and they reproduce asexually by budding off segments of the anterior end. And then we have the Rhabdidophora, which have a number of both free-living and parasitic species. So the flatworms are divided into three classes. So we have the Turbellaria, which would include the planarians, such as Dugesia. Then we have the Trematoda, which are the flukes, and this class is exclusively parasitic. Then finally we have the Cestoda, which are the tapeworms, and they are intestinal parasites of vertebrates, and they have a number of specializations for the parasitic lifestyle that we'll talk about. So the Turbellaria that we looked at were Dugesia, or the planarian. They live in freshwater and prey on smaller animals. They have light-sensitive eye spots, and in their anterior end they have a ganglion of nerve cells and a simple nerve net to innervate their muscles. That nerve net is a bit more complex than the simple nerve nets that are observed in the cnidarians. So planarians are hermaphrodites, but they can also reproduce asexually by fission. So if you cut one in half, the head end will form a tail and the tail end will form a head. So here is some slides of planarians. So you can see they have these simple little eye spots, which make them look cross-eyed to me, kind of cute. And then their body plan is relatively simple. So in the head you would have that ganglion of nerves, and nerves would extend down either side of the body. And then you have the eye spots, and here in this example the gastrovascular cavity has been injected. So you can see much of the internal anatomy is devoted to this gastrovascular cavity, and material gets in and out of that gastrovascular cavity through the mouth, which is found kind of in the center of the organism, and that is followed by this muscular structure called the pharynx, which is used to move material in and out of the gastrovascular cavity. And you can see that you have both anterior and posterior branches of that gastrovascular cavity. Okay, so the trematodes are the flukes, and they are exclusively parasites, and they parasitize a wide range of hosts. An important thing about the life cycle of the trematodes is that they frequently need an intermediate host in which the larvae develop before infecting the primary host. So an example would be the blood fluke called schistosoma, which causes a disease called schistosomiasis that infects a couple 100 million people, particularly in developing countries. So the intermediate host for schistosoma is a snail, and inside the snail, the organism undergoes a number of larval stages. So if we look at this life cycle of a snail, of the schistosoma, the fertilized eggs are passed into the water in a tough cyst structure, and that cyst structure is ingested by a snail, and then the embryo breaks out of that cyst shell and undergoes these stages of larval development until they reach the either radiae or cerciae stage, at which time they are able to be passed out of the snail into the water and are free swimming, and will embed themselves in the skin or flesh of a fish, and then if that fish is undercooked and then ingested by an animal, the larva will develop into an egg cyst, which will then, in the beginning part of the digestive system, and then will migrate through the bile duct into the liver, where they'll attach and feed on blood and begin to produce a large number of eggs, which will exit and possibly find their way into waterways and back into a snail. So this is an example of the anatomy of a fluke. You can see they have an oral sucker around the mouth, followed by a pharynx, which will help material move into the digestive system, which goes to simple intestines that run down either side of the animal. Then there's a ventral sucker, which again aids in attachment. And you can see in the case of the flukes, a large portion of the interior anatomy is devoted to reproduction. So in the middle of the animal you have an ovary, which is producing eggs, which pass into the uterus, where the eggs mature, and they are loaded with yolk granules that are produced by the yolk gland. And then you also have the testes, which will be producing the sperm, which are passed into a storage structure called the seminal vesicle. So finally, the last class of flatworms are the Cestoda, or tapeworms. So this is a large group of parasitic worms that are highly specialized to parasitize the intestinal system. So they have both suckers and hooks on their head, which is referred to as a scolex, which will anchor the worm in the digestive tract. The tapeworms lack a mouth or gastrovascular cavity, and they absorb food from their hosts across the body surface. And behind the head, a series of segments or proglottids form, which essentially fill entirely with male and female sex organs, and then the mature proglottids are loaded with thousands of fertilized eggs, which are released from segments that break off the posterior end of the worm. So if we look at the scolex of a tapeworm, you can see you have hooks at the anterior end and suckers that will help it attach to the intestinal wall, and then at the base of the head you can see here are where segments are forming, and each one of those ridges corresponds to a proglottid, which will develop sex organs, either ovaries or testes. The eggs will be fertilized and pile up in the uterus, and eventually this proglottid will completely fill with mature eggs. The next class of organisms that we looked at were the Annelidae, or the annelid worms, and this is, or I'm sorry, the next phylum were the annelid worms, and they're divided into two main classes. The first are the oligochaetes, and they are named because they have relatively few bristles or chaetae which are made of chitin. This includes earthworms as well as a variety of aquatic species. So earthworms eat soil and extract nutrients from the organic detritus that in the soil. Earthworms are hermaphrodites, but they cross-fertilize by shedding eggs and sperm between individuals that they pile up in a mucus-laden mass. So if we look at the interior anatomy of the annelid worms, you can see that in the center you have the intestine, and the intestine has this invagination, which increases the surface area, and this is referred to as the typhlosole. So the function of that typhlosole is to increase surface area. Okay, then above and below the intestine, you have dorsal and ventral blood vessels, and adjacent to the ventral blood vessel, you have a nerve cord that runs along the ventral surface of the body wall. Then the body wall is made up of some layers of muscles and an epidermis, and then each of the individual segments or rings of the worm are separated by a partition that's called a septum. And because you have these septa dividing up the worm, you must have a closed circulatory system with these blood vessels. So at the anterior head of the worm, there are a series of specialized blood vessels that contract. There are 5 of them that serve as simple hearts to make blood flow through the circulatory system. The other class in the annelid worms are the polychaetes. So the polychaetes are named because they have many chaetae, and between these bundles of chaetae they have special paddle-like protrusions that come out of the body, which are called parapodia, and they operate as both gills and aid in locomotion. So you can see here you've got these tufts of bristles or chaetae, and in between those tufts of chaetae you have the parapodia. Okay, the final phylum that we looked at was the mollusks. So this includes snails, slugs, shellfish like oysters and clams, as well as octopus and squid. Most mollusks are marine, but there are a number of freshwater and terrestrial mollusks as well. So mollusks are soft-bodied animals, but most of them have developed the ability to secrete a hard calcium carbonate shell. So all mollusks share a simple similar body plan, including a muscular foot, on top of which is found a visceral mass, so where the organs contain, and then that visceral mass is covered by a structure called the mantle. And so that the visceral mass is found inside that mantle cavity. And the mollusks feed using a rasp-like radula, which is found at the mouth, and this radula will scrape materials off of substrate and pass it into the mouth. So you can see in this generic model of a mollusk, you have a muscular foot that is used for locomotion or attachment to the substrate, and then you have a mantle cavity that is covered by this mantle, and then inside the mantle you have the visceral mass with the various organs, including a circulatory system, the intestines, and gonads. So most mollusks have separate sexes, so males and females, and the gonads are, like we said, located in that visceral mass. And the life cycle of many mollusks includes a ciliated larval stage called a trochophore. So if we go back here to the phylogeny of the animals, so if we go to the phylogeny of the animals, we can see that, just to remind you, there's this clade of the Lophotrochozoa. So that refers to animals, many of which have this developmental stage called the trochophore. Or many of them also have, like in the case of the tube worms, have a feathery structure around their mouth called a lophophore. Get back. Okay, so the major classes in the phylum Mollusca, there are two that are omitted from this table. So in addition to the Polyplacophora, the drawing here, in addition to the Polyplacophora, we have the Aplacophora, so these are mollusks that have no shell. Whoops. Let me go back. And then we also have the Monoplacophora, and these are organisms with one shell. And so these organisms will just have a single shell, and then they will attach to the substrate using a muscular foot. And under the shell you have the visceral mass. And an example of Monoplacophora would be something like an abalone. Okay, and then we have the Polyplacophora, which are commonly referred to as chitons. And these are marine organisms that have a shell on the dorsal side that contains 8 plates. The next class would be the gastropods, which would include things like the snails and slugs. So they have a head with antenna and fairly well developed eyes, and they usually have a coiled shell, and the coil in that shell is produced by a developmental process called torsion. And this involves a twisting of the visceral mass. So if we have the visceral mass here, the visceral mass will twist to the right, and that causes the shell then to be deposited in a coil like so, as that visceral mass continues to twist to the right. This is unique among the gastropods. The next class would be the bivalves, which include things like clams and scallops. So they are typified by flattened shell with two halves. They have a highly reduced head, and they are filter feeders, so they do not possess a radula. The final class are the cephalopods, which include squids, octopus, cuttlefish, and nautiluses. The squids, octopus, and cuttlefish all are soft-bodied organisms, whereas the nautilus secretes a calcium carbonate shell. So these are marine organisms. They have the head consists of the mantle, which is covering all of the internal organs, and then they have a mouth that is surrounded by grasping tentacles, which have suckers, which are used to capture prey. And they have a mouth without a radula. They will generally have a hardened chitin beak at their mouth to break prey down into smaller pieces to enter the digestive system. Okay, so that's it for this unit, and we will see you in class on Friday.